Okay, so then we'll go ahead and get started. We are excited to be here today. Again, thank you to Jennifer and Mission Advancement for presenting this, this presentation for us. And Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So good to be with you guys again. I hope some of you were in the session last month where we talked about strategic development planning. One of my favorite topics today. One of the most common questions that I get is, how do I utilize my board? How do I get my board more engaged? How do I clarify roles and expectations? So I hope that there's some good nuggets you can take out of the session. I will tell you the good news is class is probably going to end early today. This is not a super long deck or presentation. So my hope is that we will have some questions and interaction. You're welcome to ask questions as we go in the chat. And if Chelsea, you can help me kind of look at those and field those, I'm happy to stop. And then there'll be time at the end as well. So this is not a super in-depth presentation. I think you'll find this is a lot about human nature. This is a lot about how we enlist and how we, orient people to our organizations and what that looks like in terms of how a development committee might function. So let me share my screen. And get on to, there we go. Okay. So we are going to, talk specifically about the development committee function, but a lot of what I'm going to share with you today, I think is applicable in any board committee and really to the board overall. So I do want to kind of say that I am going to make some generalities that apply, in my view, kind of across the organization in terms of board engagement. But we will dig into specifically what that may look like in terms of development. So first of all, I would say that in my experience as a consultant, that how a board engages can be the greatest distinguishing factor within a nonprofit. When I see a highly engaged board that has really strong leadership in particular, to me, that can be a game changer in an organization. In a contrast to a board that is highly disengaged. So I'm thrilled to see that you guys are experiencing a lot of engagement from your board, maybe just clarifying roles and expectations or how they can actually help you move the needle is the next step for you. But this to me is one of the most important and distinguishing factors. When an organization is experiencing a highly disengaged board, it can really put an organization kind of at a standstill in some ways in terms of making significant progress, especially if they're trying to grow. So we asked the question about kind of where your board is, and I would say that you're never in one place, with every board member. And so it doesn't surprise me at all to hear that some of you have people at every end of this spectrum. And I see this as a continual moving thing for the board as a whole and for individuals. So that's normal. That's what I would say. I would say younger organizations tend to experience the micromanaging board more than more mature organizations, where disengagement seems to be more common. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory, but micromanaging boards sometimes are boards that have been involved from the very beginning when there was very limited or no staff, and the board was doing the work. And transitioning away from that model into a more kind of truly governing model can be a very, very painful transition for board members that are used to that very hands-on approach. So that's usually kind of the evolution, I think, of micromanagement over to governing and hopefully engaged. Disengagement, I see more often when you've got a very highly competent staff, quite frankly, which is a good thing. But then the board kind of feels like I'm just here to listen and advise and not really engage in a significant way. So that's typically where I would see that pendulum swinging in terms of the life cycle of an organization. But it's always moving. It's always moving. And we're going to talk a lot today about how board members or committee members are enlisted and how expectations are set. And from my experience, I would say that is the number one reason why board members behave the way they do, is how they were brought in to the board or onto the committee, how they were enlisted, what kind of expectations they were given, and what leadership is modeling for them. So, you know, I like to say as leadership goes, so goes the board. I think the same is true with staff. You know, it kind of applies in a lot of different ways, but I think particularly in a volunteer board situation, how the behavior and expectations are modeled by the leaders of the board has everything to do with how the board members as a group tend to function. So this is, you know, the way I like to describe the different, you know, areas of engagement, disengagement, or micromanagement you might be experiencing. So what kind of board are we? Boards like to give themselves different types of names, and you may have multiple boards. That's not uncommon to have an advisory board perhaps and a governing board or something like that. So these are the kinds of answers we may get to the question, what kind of board is this? They may say we're a governing board, most common. They might say we're more advisory, and maybe they are truly a second board, but sometimes even governing boards describe themselves as more of an advisory group. Sometimes they describe themselves as policy board, policy making board, and sometimes the word trusteeship is used. Foundation board is another common, you know, description if the board truly is just overseeing a foundation, and they see that role perhaps as very different. So there's really no right or wrong here. You know, the point of this piece of the presentation is just to be very clear about what their expectations are within that structure of that board, because those terms mean different things to different people. So it just kind of reinforces that we have to clarify. So this is the other response sometimes we get, but we're not a fundraising board. You know, we're a governing board, we're an advisory board, we're a whatever, we're not a fundraising board. And my answer to that question, if you are the primary board of a nonprofit that has philanthropy as a source of revenue, is yes, you are. Yes, you are. You may not realize you're a fundraising board, but if philanthropy is a source of revenue for the organization and you are on the governing primary board, fundraising has to be a component of the board's responsibility. It's part of fiduciary duty. It's like a corporation, a for-profit corporation, you know, leader saying, well, I'm not responsible or interested in like the revenue side of the business. You have to be, you know, you have to be responsible at some level for how income is brought in and how expenses go out. So if income is philanthropy, then fundraising is an important piece of the board's oversight and responsibility. So sometimes this is a, you know, interesting conversation that yes, fundraising is an important part of the board's role. So the other analogy we use sometimes is the relationship of a board to an organization, kind of like a parent. So I'm not going to take this analogy too far, don't worry. But if you're a parent, you know, you get this. I have a college student and I have a high school student. So I've been doing this for 19 years. And, you know, when you have little kids, you kind of have to figure it out, right? You do everything. And you like, I may not really love to cook. That's really not my strength. I'm really not a homemaker in that way, but who else is going to do it, right? So if I said to my kids, I'm really not a meal providing kind of mom, that's just really not what I'm good at. They'd be like, but you're the only mom I have. Or I don't really like to get on the floor and play games. That's really, I'm not that kind of mom. Well, I had to learn to become all types of mom, right? And I was better at some than others, and some came easier to me than others. But at the end of the day, my kid has one set of parents, and I have to be, you know, all things to them at some level, and learn where I have to supplement in the areas where I'm weak. So again, I'm not going to take that analogy too far because it gets a little crazy, but But the point is, they're the only board you have, right? Let's just go with that premise that you have one board. And if they're the only board you have, then if not them caring about the fundraising, caring about governance, caring about whatever, then who? That it is the role of the board to model each of those areas in the organization at some level. It doesn't mean they're heavily engaged in every area or have their hands in every piece of it, but they do need to understand it, be bought in, and participate at some level in the fundraising side of the organization. So again, they're the only board you have. So they must be somewhat involved and engaged at every level, including in philanthropy. So that's sometimes a good point of understanding. So sometimes boards do get into this management stuff. And I mentioned a minute ago, I see that a lot in younger organizations. I think somebody in the chat said they were a new organization. And your needs at that level are so different than they are when you've been around 20 plus years and you've got a good professionally paid staff. So how do you keep boards from drifting in this direction if you're moving out of that, or even if you've still got some folks that's what they really like to do? And the answer to this, from our experience, is the committee structure. So utilizing the committee structure to keep your board engaged in the right areas of the organization and out of the wrong areas, perhaps, is one way to kind of avoid board members who may drift into that management role. So it's identifying the right committees and not having the wrong committees. And that's a whole other discussion, what's right, what's wrong. We're going to talk about development specifically, but as a general rule, you don't want a lot of board committees that simply mimic specific staff functions. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, what about development? Isn't that, yes, that's like the one kind of exception to the rule. If you have a program committee or multiple program committees, that probably is going to get a little bit dicey with micromanagement tendencies if you've got staff leading those programs, right? So again, that's a really common way to start an organization, is to have the board taking those functions early on, but as paid staff become the drivers of those areas, allowing the board to step back into that governing role is typically where we see them. So people ask me all the time, what are the right committees? I say there's really three that I like to recommend. One is a governance committee. One is some kind of financial committee, and that could be called a lot of different things. It's not to mirror the CFO. It's to help with budgeting, audit, looking at the P&L every month and kind of just being that check and balance. And third is development, if philanthropy is a critical revenue stream for the organization. Governance can encompass a lot of stuff, and you can split that. So sometimes governance may be split into a nominating, you maybe have a nominating committee, and board membership and all of that kind of lives in that space. But it also kind of is board expectations, job descriptions, accountability, and really keeping the board focused on the areas that they need to do. I also like standing committees, which can be temporary, not necessarily, yeah, I think I'm saying that right, but committees that live for a period of time. So it could be task forces or other strategic planning is a great example of a committee that might function for a period of time, but might not be a permanent committee of the board. So that's the way I typically would recommend that an organization kind of think as they grow, and stay out of the weeds on all the other internal functions of the organization. Okay, so how does the board truly engage? Probably the most common question. And if you're thinking about fundraising in particular, we're going to talk about how a functional working development committee can create the kind of engagement that most development professionals, I think, are looking for. And here's the reality, right? You're never going to get this kind of engagement from every board member. So expecting every single member of your board to engage in fundraising equally is a recipe for disaster. So that's one of the reasons we really like this concept of a development committee, because it allows you to take the folks that really have the passion, the interest, the skill sets, the things that you need, and work with them as a subcommittee instead of kind of pulling teeth with board members that are never going to function for you well in this particular area. So it allows you to kind of go deeper with fewer, essentially, and to get what you really need out of a core group of people. So first of all, how do we define this? In a very broad sense, I would define it simply this way, that this is a subset that agrees to engage as impassioned volunteers working alongside you as a development staff to achieve your goals. So that's very broad because that could apply to any organization, I think, you know, in almost any sector. You may have a much more specific description of what that looks like for you, but this is essentially what you're asking them to do, is to come alongside you as a volunteer who passionately believes in this organization and to say, I could use some extra arms and legs in very specific ways to help me execute my development plan. So one, that assumes you have a good development plan, right? And we talked about that last month, whether it's a strategic plan or an annual plan, however you form that. It's, I need you to dig into my plan with me. And there's a handful of things where I could use somebody with your skill set, somebody with your passion, somebody who gives like you give and as leads by example. So we'll talk about specifics here in just a second. But what do they not do? And this is probably the most, common challenge, right, that we see. Here is what the development committee is not supposed to be. They are not your manager, right? And that needs to be clear. Your CEO or ED or whoever you report to is still your manager. They're not there to help you do tactics. This is not getting in the weeds unless there's something really specific you're asking for. That's your job. Your job as the leader is to devise the tactics for your team, for your organization. They are not your event planners. And if I see one thing most common, it's this: the development committee is essentially planning the gala. That's what they think their role is, or that's what they want to do, or that's all they talk about is what our next big event is. Not a great use of a development committee in the way that we're describing. You don't want them to get in the weeds on hiring or firing. That doesn't mean they can't help you vet candidates or think through job descriptions or whatever. But again, you got to make these clear lines of what your job is in running your team, if you have a team to run, and how you report up to your CEO or ED. And that, they are a collaborator, not a manager, and not somebody that's giving you hiring and firing advice or decisions at a tactical level. The event planning one is the one I see the most. So that's the one that I'll walk in and be like, so what does a typical agenda look like? Oh, well, we're picking out the napkins, or we're talking about the entertainment for the whatever. And that's the most common kind of slippery slope, I think, that development committees tend to take. So those are some common misperceptions. So let's talk about the communication then. If that's not their job, how do we clarify communication lines? Hopefully this is what your board and staff communication looks like, with your executive director or CEO as the go-between, right? He or she is the funnel of information to staff and the funnel to the board from staff. And you don't have board going around that person to, manage staff or anything like that. At the committee level, then what we're looking for is a subset, right? A subset of staff, a subset of board that begin to have this collaborative relationship over to the side. And it really is, a subset of both groups that meet, outside of board meetings, outside of staff meetings, and begin to have this more collaborative dynamic of how can we work together on this particular piece of the organization's strategy, and ask you guys to really work with us, speak into it, help us with strategy, help us think through how to execute, how to solve problems, but keep those other big lines of communication clear. So this is, I think, an important conversation if you enlist a development committee to kind of clarify that this isn't taking the place of the current board reporting structure. This is a subset that we want to have a collaboration outside of that structure. So what's the secret to success? In our view, as I said at the beginning, it has everything to do with how people are enlisted. And this is where I think this is applicable completely across the board itself, meaning how you enlist board members to serve on the board, in addition to how you enlist members to serve on a committee of any kind. So I would say this concept is applicable in many different scenarios of volunteer management, particularly within your board. So what does that mean? How do we build or enlist folks to serve, whether it's on a committee, whether it's on the board itself? Here's some tips. So first of all, we have to identify the right people. Who do we want in this role and why? And this applies again, just for the board itself, for any other board committee, is we got to be thoughtful about who it is that we ideally would like to serve in that role. We got to think about how we're going to ask them, very simply. And it sounds very simple, but I'll give you an example of how this goes rogue. So you do need an enlistment plan for how you're going to ask them to actually participate. There's got to be some training and orientation. And this is another, I think, common challenge with boards in general, as well as committees. So think about it from your nonprofit experience. Nonprofit boards in different organizations look and function and have cultures that are very different. And you may enlist somebody on your board or on your committee, and you may say, this person would be perfect because he or she sat on that board and did fundraising in this capacity and was involved in this organization. And that's great. Like, that all makes really good sense. But you can't expect that your culture, that your board, your expectations look exactly the same as what they may have done somewhere else. So regardless of somebody's experience, and they may have sat on dozens of boards, there is still a need to train and orient members to your organization's culture, expectations, and accountability, essentially. They may have sat on a board that was super advisory, and they have no expectation of involvement in fundraising. Maybe the last board they sat on told them they didn't have to give, and your board says, we want all board members to give. So whatever those differences may be, we can't assume they're coming to the table with the same expectations they've had somewhere else. So if you don't have a training and orientation program for new board members, for committee members, this is a critical piece of laying out expectations and getting the kind of engagement that you want. You know, I'm going to take a tangent here and just kind of tell you a story, but one of the most common, you know, complaints, I guess, to be just candid, is, you know, well, the board doesn't do this, or they don't do this, they don't understand this. And usually I'll sit with the CEO and say, talk to me about how that board member was, how long that board member's been here, number one. How long have they been on the board? What has happened since that time in the organization? If it's been a long time, how many CEOs have been in this seat since then? What was their expectation when you enlisted that person? What were they given at that time? What did that look like? Did you sit with them and talk about the role? Were they given a job description? How has the board chair responded to expectations? How have they modeled expectations? And usually, you know, the simple answer to those questions becomes, we need to basically hit the reset button on board expectations, because we've got folks that have been here 15 years who have one set of expectations, and folks that have been here 1 year with a different set of expectations. And we've really never pulled all that together and been super clear about what their job description looks like, what we expect in terms of meeting attendance, what we expect in terms of committee work, if that's an expectation. So many times it's just this culmination of years, probably, of board turnover and people moving in and out of different leadership seats that have created this this complete disconnect of what they expect of me as a board member. So usually that's the root cause, is just redefining expectations and how people were enlisted. So here's some common things that we've seen when we identify and enlist board members. How about this one? Donna has a lot of time on her hands, so she would be good. So obviously that's a common mistake, right? Just because somebody's not busy is not why we want them on a committee. Usually the busiest people are the best committee members. That's my experience, but we don't want to look at folks just because they appear to be available. How about this one? Raise your hand if you want to be on this committee. I highly discourage this practice, especially on your development committee, maybe because it's my personal passion. But I really believe these are folks that we need to personally choose or enlist. And they may not even think they're the right person for this committee, but you see something in them that you say, yes, that skill set or that passion you have is exactly what I need. Hand raisers are usually well-intentioned people, but too many times they don't understand what it is you're looking for. And this is where the event people end up on your committee. You know, they look at development committee and think gala. And that's immediately where their head goes of what I want to be on a committee to talk about. And then it's really hard to undo that. So that's the second challenge. The third one is this, and this is where enlistment becomes important. This is easy. You really don't even have to come to all the meetings, right? So I'd like to believe this never happens. This happens a lot, especially in peer-to-peer enlistment, meaning board member to board member. So how should this look then? How do we identify the right people? First of all, they have to have passion for what you do. And that seems like super obvious, but it's not always the case. You know, sometimes we enlist people to serve on a board or on a committee because we think they have a skill set that we need, and it really doesn't matter that we're not at the top of their sort of philanthropic priorities. And I would say that's a mistake. There's other places for volunteers, perhaps, that have skill sets or other things you may want besides a board seat or a committee seat, which is pretty limited. They got to care about what you do. If they don't, I don't think you're going to get really what you need from them. They may just come and check a box and give you some advice here and there, but they really need to be bought into your mission to be effective in a board seat or even in a committee seat. They've got to be a donor. For me, this is a non-starter. Now, I know there's a lot of boards out there that enlist people to maybe serve on the board and kind of use the board experience as a way to kind of cultivate. That's personally not the approach I would recommend. Again, I think there's ways to utilize people outside the board, but I think to sit on a board and sit on a committee, they need to be a donor. And especially on your development committee, I don't think you can have an effective development committee member who doesn't understand what it looks like to be a donor. Because one of the things you're wanting from them is to help give advice and guidance on the donor experience. And if they haven't had the donor experience, it's really hard for them to see it through that lens. So to me, this is a non-starter, that they not only care about your mission, but they're already a donor to you at some level. Ideally, you want people with networks. Now, this can look really different for different folks, and it depends on what you need as an organization. There may be people that represent a segment of your donor base, and you say, this person knows, you know, a network of people that are connected to us already, and they can really help us look at things through the lens of that group of people, you know, event sponsors or other major donors, you know, something like that. Maybe it's corporate, maybe it's foundation, that they've got, you know, networks in the foundation world, and they can really help you open doors in that particular segment. So I would look at this network idea, not just from, you know, what neighborhood do they live in or how many rich people do they know, but really more like, who are those segments of donors that this person sort of lives in those circles or understands how those donors interact with us, and how can they bring insight into how donors experience our mission? So that could look very different depending on your donor base, but to me, that's the greatest value they can bring. Opening doors, absolutely. That's certainly something you want a subset of folks to be able to do for you. Willingness to lead by example. This is on the development committee in particular, a really important piece of their role. As a development person, and when I'm working with a development person, I always say, you want your development committee and your chair in particular to be your advocate at the board table. And if they do nothing else for you, it should be that. It should be, okay, development committee chair, if Chelsea's my chair, I'm going to meet with Chelsea or talk to Chelsea before every board meeting. And I'm going to say, this is what my development report looks like. This is what I'm going to be sharing with the board. As the development committee chair, some of the nuances of where we are fundraising, good, bad, or indifferent. Here's the message I really need to get across to the board. And this is what it would help me if you would reiterate this. So I want Chelsea to come to that board meeting knowing that she has a job of advocating for me at some level, for my team at some level, explaining to the board perhaps why a strategy is working really well or not working. There's just, you guys all know this, right? There's just a difference in peer-to-peer communication than staff to board in a board meeting. And so having that development committee chair leading by example in this way can be really powerful for you as a development person in the organization. It also encompasses the way they give, the way they participate, whatever your expectation is of an average board member, you want your development committee and development committee chair leading the way. So if you've set an example that you need 100% board participation in a particular campaign, your annual appeal, whatever, they got to be the first ones to do it, right? They've got to be the ones saying, we've done it, we're in, here's what we need the rest of the board to do. So just setting that leadership by example is critical. And then there may be an area of expertise. And this is going to be really specific to what you need, especially if you have gaps. For a younger organization that may have limited resources and paid staff, this can be a way that you really can bring in an area of expertise that isn't on your team. So an example of this could be communications. A lot of times communications will fall under development in an organization. If you don't have paid staff or you've got limited paid staff or somebody's doing this, part-time, you may want somebody on this committee that can really help supplement looking at your messaging, your external communication, either helping you write some of it or just reading it and giving you feedback, something like that. So that could be an area of expertise that you could say, we're really weak in this area. We really can't pay somebody right now to come in and do this full time. Could you work alongside me to really help me with our messaging to our donor base in our appeals and our letters and our digital communication, whatever that is. Another example of this might be attorneys. Okay, I had a client last year and they enlisted a development committee, and I didn't realize until after they had done it that 3 out of the 4 committee members were attorneys. And I thought I was gonna shoot myself when I got to that first meeting because they're lovely people and I love attorneys, but 1 out of 4 is plenty on a committee, right? Because they all wanted to go toward policies and procedures and language and how do we, which is wonderful. But having one person do that would be great. Having the entire committee, thinking that way was, it really kind of prevented us from talking about all the other things we needed to do. But that's a great area of expertise, especially if you're looking at plan giving and legacy and you want somebody that kind of represents how to do that well and bring you language and all that good stuff. That could be a great area of expertise on this committee. So those are all the qualifications that I would look for when we say, who do we really want to serve? What do we need? What are those skill sets or that leadership by example that we know we need on this committee? How do we identify the folks that we want? So then how do we enlist them well? And this is so simple, but man, I really can't tell you how important this is. And I think you'd be shocked to know how rarely people are enlisted at a board level with this kind of approach, and what a difference it makes in how they serve and how they jump into a volunteer commitment. First of all, this needs to be face-to-face. Okay, and if you're doing Zoom today, so even in a COVID world, this needs to be face-to-face. This is not a phone call. This is not a, hey, will you do me a favor? Setting the tone for this being an important role in the organization is critical. And I think just this step alone sets the tone. So if you can't meet together in a physical space, but you can do Zoom. That would be the next best thing. If you are the development director or head of development in your organization, don't do this alone. It could be your executive director and your board chair. It could be just your board chair. But I think this is a 3-person meeting. And maybe it's a 4-person, depending on the role that you're asking them to play. It just lends the importance to it. This is not a casual, hey, we need to fill a seat. Would you fill a seat? This is, hey, this is a role we're asking you to play. And we really want to talk it through with you and help you understand what we want this to look like. So this is not a simple casual, this is a face-to-face, at least a 3-person. It lends that importance to the process. We have to lay out the role of the committee in this case, or the board, and we have to be clear about expectations. So in the enlistment process, we want to say, this is what we expect from the committee. We expect you to be a donor. We expect you to give the way that we ask our board to give. We expect you to lead by example. We expect you to attend meetings at this type of interval, whatever it is. So lay it out from the very beginning. I like to have it in writing and have it to give to them so they can look at it. It's very specific and it's very clear. Once we've enlisted, and hopefully we've gotten a yes, and I like to say in a good enlistment that I always say, I'm not asking you for an answer right now. I'm asking you to think about this. Like, this is a really important role. I want you to be clear about it. If you have questions, I want you to come ask me and not just give it a yes right away. So take a few days, think about it. Let's chat again and let me know what you'd like to do. So again, it just kind of lends that importance to the process. And it's not just a quick, hey, give me an answer right now so I can schedule the meeting next week. Okay, once we've gotten a yes and we feel like we have the right people around the table, how do we train? And this goes back to, just because somebody's a really experienced board member or they've been a fundraiser before, it might feel very intimidating. Like, I think that's the biggest roadblock to training. I even, I'm supposed to go talk to a development committee of an organization here in the Dallas area. And I met with the executive director a couple of weeks ago, and she said, well, our board doesn't like to be trained. Like, they don't think they need training. So we really can't call this a training. And I was like, okay, well, what should we call it? A conversation? Like, I'll give it whatever name we need to give it. But they as a staff are so concerned that this board won't receive training because they don't think they need training, that bringing somebody in from the outside feels a little overwhelming. It feels a little uncomfortable for them. And so again, when you enlist people to serve, like, I think it's okay to say, like, you bring amazing experience to our board or amazing experience to our committee. It's really important that we as an organization have a clear understanding of how we want to function and what it looks like in the life of this organization at this time, which may or may not look like it did within other organizations where you may have served. So this is just an exercise in getting everybody on the same page. And recognizing they bring great things from other experiences, but that they may or may not be exactly what your organization needs at this time. So what does your development operation look like? If you have a strategic development plan, this is the orientation, right? Walk them through it. If you've got just at least an outline of an annual plan or whatever those goals are, this is you as the development professional orienting your committee into your strategy and helping them understand the strategy of development outside of your budget. So if you were on the webinar last month, I hit on that several times, that our budget is one thing, and our budget is good, and our budget is helpful, and I'm a big fan of budgets. But we have to look at our development office through another lens, which is the lens of our donors and the lens of retention, and how are our donors giving to us? What do they care about? Why are they coming back? Why are they not? And that's a different kind of vision or lens through which we see development that's different than budget. So that's what you need to walk them through, is where do dollars come from in this organization? What do our donor segments look like? And how does that fit into our budget? But really, how do we look at our sources of development and how those sources are engaging with us year over year? So you got to orient them to your strategy. And this, to me, I mean, I'm kind of passionate about this. I'm passionate about it because too many times I see development directors let their development committees or their boards, I guess the right way to say this is you kind of let the tail wag the dog, right? And it's so easy, especially if you have a board of people who are super experienced and maybe very successful in a corporate setting or very successful in a community volunteer setting, and they've got great resumes and accolades, and you say, oh, I'm just the development person. No, you are the expert. You are the expert in development. And in almost every case, there may be a handful of exceptions, but in almost every case, you've been doing it longer than they have, right? And so you need to be the expert in the room. And this is your opportunity to be the strategist, right? And to share with them your vision, your strategy, and to help them come along and learn, really how your organization leads a development operation and how you want this strategy to be executed. You're not looking for them to come to the table with a bunch of new ideas. And that's sometimes what they think. Like, I'm coming here so I can help my development director do this better. And maybe they've never thought about Amazon Smile. And maybe I need to share with them how much money we could be raising if we just spent all of our time and energy getting our donors on Amazon Smile, right? I give that example because I had a board member say that in a meeting one time. And I thought, oh, I mean, he's so well-intentioned. He's brilliant. He's a super successful business guy. But I thought, that is not where we need to spend time and resources. If every person in this county selected your organization for Amazon Smile, and those are the stats he was giving, it was great. Like, if every person in our county chose us, we would raise $2.5 million a year. Well, that would be lovely, but that's not going to happen. And so our strategy is got to be our strategy, and the committee's got to be there to come along with us on our strategy, not to derail our strategy or tell us new and different ways that they read, we should be doing fundraising. Okay, so in the training, we orient them to our strategy, right? And we kind of set that tone. We also clarify expectations, as a group. We ease their anxiety around fundraising. And this is also part of the enlistment conversation, because you would talk about expectations. You're not asking them to go out and make the ask by themselves, probably. There may be some that want to do that and you're comfortable doing that, and that's great. But in general, that's not the role of development committee. You may want some to go with you. There may be folks that you say, you can be a powerful force as a volunteer. When I go meet with this donor, would you come with me? That would be a great role for a development committee member, but you need to ease the anxiety that you're not going to go give them a portfolio of donors and say, please go meet with these folks and cultivate and solicit and raise, $1 million. So ease their anxiety that that's not what development committee means. It's really working alongside you in executing your strategy. And if that means coming along, great. Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes it's behind the scenes. And then the last one I would say is this training on what we call relationship-based fundraising. So again, we're trying to orient them to a more donor-centric way of looking at our development operation and a less budget-centric. So if you were on the webinar last month, we talked about your top 100 sources and what percentage of your philanthropy budget does that represent, and how are we engaging with those donors? Orienting them to that type of fundraising and that lens through which they see development will give them a different voice at the board table. And that's why I think it's so critically important that you engage this committee at this level, because they can be in a board meeting, and when you've got somebody around the board table that's questioning a strategy, or why is this event not successful, or why didn't this campaign perform the way we wanted it to, they can come alongside you to say, let's go back, let's go back to how we're trying to engage this segment of donors, and what are we really trying to achieve? And anyway, you can go on and on about how that may look, but training them on this kind of donor-centric mindset gives them a different lens and a different voice at the board table to say, this is why, this is why we need the board looking at it this way. This is why we need your participation in this way. This is why the development team is analyzing, this event to see whether this is something we need to move away from. And they can really support you in the underlying strategies behind what the story the budget tends to tell. So train them on that donor-centric mindset so that they begin to look at it in a way that they can bring other board members along. Okay, so considering defining roles, you may or may not want to take a path like this. This is just an example of how you might structure a committee if you want to define specific roles. So the org chart I would draw would be, the committee reports to the board ultimately, and then they have this peer relationship with you as development team. The two positions that I would for sure recommend if you have the right people is communications, which I mentioned a minute ago. That's a great way to plug people in with that skill set. And what I'm just calling generally major gifts, which is that relationship type support. So again, thinking about your segments of donors and saying, are there people on the board that might be a good kind of representative of that segment of donors that could go along with me on some of these visits, or help me think through strategy within that segment of donors and how we can maybe do a better job of engaging that group or growing or whatever we're trying to accomplish. So think about donor segments. Other examples, planned giving. I mentioned our favorite attorney friends that love this and may be able to really help you in that area, which is a great way for them to dig in. Events, yes, but let's be clear, right, of what their role is. If you have event chairs, if that's a model that is in your organization, so if let's just say you have a gala, you have gala chairs every year, that's a pretty common strategy. I'm good with your gala chairs sitting on this committee, even if they're not board members. And that's another kind of common question. Can you put non-board members on a development committee? I say yes, unless you've got a bylaw or something that prevents you from doing that. I think it's great for event chairs to sit on this committee so they have the global perspective of how that event fits into a broader strategy. So, your events are never done in a vacuum. They're always part of a broader strategy to build relationships or stewardship or whatever you're trying to accomplish or meet new people. So for them to hear the broader strategy of development and how that event fits into that, I think can be really healthy. As long as they understand that's one component and the entire committee has a much broader lens through which they are viewing the fundraising piece. So those are some examples of other specific roles that you might define. Another one might be corporations or foundations. Again, I've kind of put that in that major gift category, but that may be a segment that you're trying to grow. And if you've got somebody that has great networks there or experience in the foundation world or something like that, you could say, can you come sit on this committee and just have the role of opening doors to new foundations? or helping us build relationships with existing foundations. That's a great specific role that somebody could play. Okay, so what do meetings look like? First of all, people ask me, how often should a committee like this meet? Well, that depends on how often your board meets. My favorite structure of board committees is if the board meets every other month, the committees meet on the off months. To me, that's an ideal structure. Now, I know that's not how everybody functions, but that's the way I like to see it. I think every other month is a really good rhythm that keeps people engaged and gives your agendas lots of meat and lots to talk about. And if the committees can meet on those off months, that's another, monthly kind of way for them to engage in the organization. So one month is full board meeting, the next month is subcommittee meeting. I think more than that, you can struggle for content, quite frankly, and how to make those meetings meaningful. And that's what I find to be a root cause sometimes of disengagement, is the meetings aren't meaningful. And so people tend to stop showing up because they don't feel like they're getting a lot out of it, or they don't have a lot to contribute. So that's what I like in terms of frequency. So what does the meeting look like? First of all, go back to the relationship-based activities. How are we doing in terms of our retention? Which donors are specifically, where have we seen growth? Specifically, where are we lapsing? And how can we attack those problems, or at least be aware of how specific sources of giving are responding to us? Maybe some brainstorm around those functions and how they can engage with staff. So again, go back to those specific functions like foundations, corporations, communications, planned giving. How could development committee members come alongside staff, not manage them, not dictate to them, not any of that, but how could they lend some support to your team if you've got some gaps in skill sets? So what might that look like? You got to have specific assignments, and there's got to be some follow-up, right? Otherwise, people just come, they talk, they leave, nothing happens. So this is another important role of that chair, your development committee chair, to be clear at the end of the meeting what you've agreed to, what assignments people may have taken, and when they've agreed to complete those. Ideally, you want the chair being the one holding them accountable and not you. And that's hard, especially if it's your job, right? And it's your job to get it done. But this is another enlistment kind of conversation with that chair. Is one thing I really need you to do is hold those people accountable, which means I may need you to call them in between meetings and check on them to see where they are with things. And I need you to call on them in a meeting to ask, not necessarily me. So if they can lead the accountability, my experience is people are much more likely to respond, much more likely to get it done when they've got a peer that's following up with them and holding them accountable, as opposed to a staff member. So making sure there's clear agreements at the end of every meeting keeps them meaningful and keeps people engaged. Okay, so how do you start? If you want to begin a committee or maybe reform a committee, which is great. I had a client not too long ago that had what they called an external affairs committee, which was not functioning. It was kind of dead in the water. And they kind of decided to disband that committee and form a development committee and basically restart. So there's different ways to do that, but if you're going to restart or restart, first of all, sit down with your executive director and your board chair and have this conversation. Again, you've got to have buy-in from at the board chair level for this to be effective. If the board chair doesn't believe in it, you're going to struggle to have a well-functioning committee that the board chair is going to see as important and valuable. So have this conversation with your executive director, your board chair, other key leaders to talk about what you want this committee to do, and then start small. I would much rather have one person to be my, confidant and my development committee chair for a year than to have 5 people that aren't there, functioning well, and I feel like I'm, wasting my time and their time, and it's frustrating. So 1 or 2 is fine. There's no reason to put 6 or 7 people on a committee that you're, just beginning to form. So I would say identify the one that you really, really want. And then maybe talk to that person about whether the committee should be filled out quickly, or maybe that you slow play and do this over a 6 or 12-month period. And then as you build, consider adding somebody who's not on the board. Again, if this is per your bylaws and policies, something that you can do, I do think the development committee is a pretty good place. It's better, you can't put the governing committee, that doesn't work, right? That's not a good place for non-board member. But sometimes, putting a non-board member on a committee like this is a great way to kind of determine whether they're a great fit for your board, whether they really have the characteristics, the buy-in, the passion for what you do, and to ask them to help you in a really specific way, especially if they have a skill set that you really need. Ask them to serve on a committee for a year or so, and then maybe invite them to the board after that. So those are a handful of things that I have found to be super helpful. All right, so getting close to the end here, but what should a development committee essentially do? Number 1, they lead by example, and they challenge the board's involvement. So they lead the way of what you expect from your board, and they're willing to say at the board table, hey board, we need the rest of you to step up into these things that we've asked you to do. It's critical for development. This is something we all agreed to. We need to lead the way in this particular area. We're asking for your participation. It may mean the development committee chair gets on the phone with people and follows up, or asks the board chair to do that, but they've got to lead by example and show the rest of the board what an engaged board member looks like when it comes to your development expectations. It should not replace the need for the entire board's involvement though, right? So as I said before, the entire board needs to feel some fiduciary duty and responsibility for the revenue of the organization. So they're not replacing that, they're just setting an example and functioning with you in a much deeper way. And they're going to serve as those additional resources that you feel you need to achieve your plan. Okay, but let's be clear, it's your plan. It's your plan that you own, that you teach, that you lead as the professional, and you are guiding them into areas where you feel like you could use some additional expertise or skill sets. You're not asking them to create the plan, you're asking them to follow you and execute the plan with you. And they never should preside over development staff. It's kind of a given, but occasionally that can be a little overbearing. That's really important for the board chair and the ED or CEO to set that tone, that you don't report to that person. That's not the relationship. They're really your partner and collaborator. Okay, that is the end of the deck. I'm happy to field some questions, Chelsea.
Last time we had one question about the language that you give to members on their roles and expectations, and getting those in writing. Is there a form or a template you recommend, or is there, can you talk a little more about what that looks like?
Yeah, for the development committee specifically?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've got, a sample job description. I'm happy to share that. It's pretty broad, but it kind of just restates some of the things that I shared here about leadership by example, and being a donor, being a contributor, and fulfilling maybe a specific role or skill set. But yeah, I think, quite frankly, anything you give them in writing is probably more than they've had anywhere else. That's my experience anyway. Rarely do people have committee job descriptions on a board. So I think anything that you can put in front of them that clarifies is helpful, but I'm happy to share something that I have.
Awesome. And I was also going to add, in our board toolkit, we have some board agreements and some definitions of different committee members that you might also be able to pull from. So if you're a member, you have access to that for free, that you might be able to build your own. I don't think it's exactly what you were describing, Jennifer, but one of the helps.
Yep, that's great.
And if anybody else has any questions, feel free to take yourself off mute if you have specific things you want to ask Jennifer. This is your time.
Hi, this is Janet, and I just want to thank Jennifer for this. I'm a new CEO for an organization that's been around for almost 20 years, and I love the language that you use about, sometimes there's just time to reset, and that's where we are. So I feel like I'm in a really great place with the board that was disengaged now is really to engage. We have 5 new board members out of 12. And so we're reinvigorating there's never been a fundraising development committee before. So in the process right now of I did almost everything you said in the beginning, Jennifer, making sure you have the right people. And so we're going to schedule our new committee, our first committee meeting. And actually I was going to do everything wrong in that first committee meeting. So I'm kind of happy that I listened to some of your suggestions, and I think it's really important. And I was the one that was asking about that job description for a development member, because I think seeing what you have in language is really going to be really important. My question to you is, I'm always so troubled, and I'm sure others are, with the give get language, and almost we're going to be thinking about changing it, but how do you work with members on the development committee to lead by example, and just love to hear some opinion on that give get, because it is an important piece.
Yeah, great question, and good for you on the reset. I think that's a great approach. Okay, so here's my honest, candid opinion on this, all right? And this is just me, doesn't mean it's right for everybody, but first of all, I'm not a fan of a give-get. I'm a fan of give, and I'm a fan of get, but I'm not a fan of give or get, which is typically what I see. I'm not sure that's exactly what you were describing, but I see a lot hey, every board member needs to give or get $5,000 or some number. I think giving is critical. Personal giving is critical. And I think most board members, should be willing to open networks, introduce friends, introduce, colleagues, whatever that may look like, not necessarily solicit. Not everybody's good at that. You don't want everybody doing that. And too many times, I think that get mentality turns into a quid pro quo with people. And when that board member's gone, that donor may be gone, so it's hey, I need to raise X amount for this organization as a board member. Will you do this? And, so anyway, that's number one. Here's the way I like to frame the personal giving. And, depending on your mission and a lot of different factors, you can kind of think about what makes sense for you. But I like to say, if somebody's going to serve on the board, which is a limited group of people, a small number of people that have, a lot of important roles for you as an executive director in particular, that if this is not in their top 3 or maybe top 5 in philanthropic priority, that maybe the board is not the right seat. Doesn't mean they can't be a great volunteer. And so here's what I mean by that. If most people, just data tells us, right? Most people's number 1 and 2 priorities tend to be religion and education. That's where most people would say their highest priorities are. So it could be a local church or synagogue or other thing like that, or alma mater. That tends to be people's kind of 1 and 2. So that's why I say 3, because most human service or other organizations shouldn't expect to be much higher than 3. Sometimes I say 5 because, you may have folks that are really plugged into the community and they're really passionate about other things, and that's great. They can still be a great board member. But when I get past 5, I start to struggle with, if they're giving more money to 5, 6, 7 or other organizations than they are to mine, and they're sitting on my board, then I probably struggle with whether this is really an organization that they are super passionate about. And that looks different for everyone, right? That has nothing to do with how much they give. It has nothing to do with capacity. It has everything to do with priority for them. And that's pretty nebulous, I know, because you may have a board member that doesn't have a lot of resources, and $1,000 might be a fantastic gift for that board member. And you may be in their top 3 or their top 5. That's wonderful. But if you've got somebody sitting on your board that you know has a lot of capacity, and they're giving you $1,000 a year, and they're giving 5 other organizations $25,000 a year, I just question whether you want them around the board table, you know, because you want your board to be the people that are the most passionate, the most engaged in helping you move this organization forward. And I think we all speak a little bit with our pocketbooks. And if we have a lot of money going elsewhere and not into this organization, I just question whether the board seat's the right seat. And I say that very specifically because we need those people, and there may be other places we could utilize them. But until we know they're an engaged donor and at a level that is sort of commensurate with that board responsibility, that's just my personal kind of opinion on that. So that's the way I like to frame it. And I've coached organizations to frame it that way, that part of the board job description is that you give personally. If you represent a corporation or other entity, that's great, but that's different. And so your gift from your company is different than your gift from you personally. And that your personal giving is a reflection of this organization being a high or a top 5 or something kind of philanthropic priority for you personally. The other way I've framed it before that some organizations like is giving to this organization should be something that you and your significant other talk about. And whatever that looks like for you, that may be different, but we want this to be a gift that you sit down with whoever in your life you make decisions, financial decisions with, and say like, hey, let's talk about how we want to support this organization this year. So it's thoughtful. It's thoughtful, and it's not just a convenient or easy or my minimum contribution is $1,000 to sit on the board, and so I'm going to write my $1,000 check and be done.
Wow. Yes, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. And do you see this conversation as something I would love to be able to talk to this with my chair of the development committee. And this is something for my chair to bring up as a discussion, because I think it's very nebulous right now. Nobody's quite sure what it is, what the level is, and it is looked at as give-get, not a give or a get, as you described. So is that something we bring up during the first meeting, or, and first of all, talk to the board chair, not the board chair, but the committee chair?
Yeah, I would start with the development committee chair, because you want him or her to sort of be the champion, I think, with you in resetting expectations, perhaps, of what board participation looks like at all levels, including personal giving. And then maybe the two of you meet with the board chair together and just say, hey, we really want to think about how we reset board expectations. And when it comes to giving specifically, we've got some ideas, and try to get the board chair's buy-in before you would figure out a plan to roll that out to the full board.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's always been a struggle for me. And I appreciate so much clarity on that.
You're welcome. I appreciate the question, because I do think it's a touchy subject and it's not an easy one to attack. And it's another one of those that I think, as I mentioned many times today, like people come to a board with very different experiences. And so assuming that what you want is what they have done before is not a good assumption. And they may have come from a give or get board, and they think that's what every board does, or or they weren't asked to give before. And I mean, I've sat with board members who say, I give my time and that's my gift. I don't give my money. Like, that's my gift to the organization, is my time. And I mean, it's easier for me as a consultant, right, to say, look, I appreciate that's where you're coming from, but I'm not sure that that really serves this board well. And how can you expect others in the community to do something you're not willing to do? I mean, that's the other language I use with boards all the time. Like, if not you, then who? Because donors look at a board as the most engaged, the most knowledgeable, the most bought in group of volunteers that exist in the organization. And if you're going to ask me to be a donor, I'm going to do a concentric circle kind of, thinking. My expectation as a donor is that board members are the most invested in every way, and that they would never say to me, hey, come give me $5,000 if they're not giving something that's meaningful to them. So that's the other way that I think sometimes boards kind of, their eyes get really big when I say something like that. Like, like, other people expect you guys to go first. And how can you ask others to do something you're not willing to do yourself? So.
Great, thank you.
Jennifer, there's a question in the chat about, can you elaborate on focus on relationship-based activities as part of the development committee? Maybe
Yes.
They struggle a bit on creating agendas that are more than just report outs.
Agreed. Yes, great question. So when I say relationship-based activities, here's the way I would start is look at your donors by source. Okay, so pull a segment. Maybe it's your top 10, maybe it's your top 50, maybe it's your top 100, maybe it's your top 500. I mean, there's no magic to the number, but pull out your top, a top group of donors and look at their giving last year cumulatively and look at their giving this year. And maybe it's year to date. If you've got a good CRM, you can, somebody can help you with that. It's a great report to be able to pull and show them that and say, you know what, we look at budget all the time and budget's great, but here's what I really want you guys to understand. The top 100 donors to our organization represent 70% of our philanthropy, whatever the number is, right? It's probably more than 50%. So let's talk about how we as a committee can look more deeply at how we are retaining and engaging our top 100 sources, regardless of where they're giving to us in the budget. So maybe they gave to the event last year and this year they gave it to a appeal, because of COVID, whatever. But educate them into the donor-centric mindset of, this is how much this group of donors contributes to our organization. I want you guys to look at that with me and understand, really what drives budget, which is how those sources are giving or not giving, and how we can strategize if we have lapsed donors, or how we can grow a donor that may have a lot more capacity than what they're giving to us today. That's what I mean by the relationship-based strategy. So pick a segment, educate them about historically what that segment represents into your philanthropy budget, and then look at the trends. I mean, that would be something you could do at every meeting, is to review your top, whatever, 50, 100, 500, and look at that year to date as another kind of metric. And then pull your budget right next to it and then kind of compare, so where are those dollars going and why, and where are people giving and why? But really educate them as to how those top donors are retaining or not retaining, and what's happening donor by donor.
And another question, what should your financial commitment expectations be from the board when all of the members of your organization are already paying high dues just to be a member?
Oh boy, membership organizations. That's a whole other topic, right? That's tough. Let's see. And I don't know, do you mind telling me what the organization is? Sorry, is that? I'm just curious.
It's the Austin Area Research Organization.
structure and what that looks like?
So we have 130 members from the region, the 6-county region. They are CEOs of banks, they're lawyers, they are the president of Texas State, the executive director of Mission Capital. People like that are very involved in the community. They work on policy issues and things like that, and try to go out into the community and influence a better quality of life in Central Texas, basically.
Okay. So they're board members and they pay a membership dues.
Yes. They pay an annual membership dues based on the size of the organization that they work for.
Got it. Okay. But you guys also raise philanthropy, right?
We don't at this time, but what we are looking at is to start that to supplement our research funds that right now the members are giving to, but not really consistently. I mean, we have like maybe 3 or 4 people a year out of the 130 that give to it, but we're looking to increase that. We have several projects, like there's a cancer initiative and so forth, that we would like to be able to fund additional research projects or so forth through this.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So great question. Membership organizations historically, and I'm part of some, so I understand it as a member. Philanthropy is tough. It's a tough case when you require dues to do the over and above. So the key, and it's great that I think you're kind of piloting this because you have the opportunity to really set the tone from the beginning. The key is you have to have a compelling case. I mean, that to me at the end of the day, like there has to be something really specific or compelling that a member says, yes, my dues offset this, or they cover this, or, you know, there's got to be a story behind why I pay dues and what that does. And then there has to be a different story about why philanthropy is critical and what the philanthropy allows you to do. So here's an example. It's not a membership organization, but I think it'll prove this kind of point. So think about a private school. Okay, we work with a lot of private secondary schools. So if your kid goes to a private school, you pay tuition. Most of those schools also raise philanthropy, right? So in a similar way, we have this conversation with schools all the time. How do I ask parents to give over and above? And schools have to make a case for their annual fund, essentially, and what tuition doesn't cover. And I think in a membership organization, it's similar. You know, there's a lot of differences, but in a similar way, you've got to make the case for what dues don't cover.
Okay.
So at a school, like a lot of schools, we'll work with them on defining that, what we might call that gap, as the margin of excellence or something like that. You know, there's different language to put around that, but you can imagine as a parent of a student, right, that you might say, look, tuition allows us to do X, Y, and Z, but in order for us to have these kinds of, you know, extracurricular programs or athletics or arts or, you know, whatever, that's what our margin of excellence fund allows us to be as a school.
Okay.
And so I think in a similar way, membership organizations have to tell that story. And I mean, you've got to cultivate essentially that culture of philanthropy from folks that have a dues mentality. But if there's a compelling story, if you say, you know, philanthropy allows us to not, dues allow us to do this, philanthropy allows us to do this. And what is that gap and what's that story?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Good.
And another question in the chat: what's a reasonable donation requirement for board members of a small new nonprofit with no dues or tuition payments involved? I think especially starting out, people aren't sure where to set that.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question to answer because I mean, I go back to what I kind of said a minute ago about priority. I'm not a fan of setting a number. I'm not a fan of setting a baseline, because that becomes a ceiling for people that could give more sometimes, or it becomes a barrier for people who might not be able to give. Because you want people on your board, right, of all walks of life. you don't want board members only that are high capacity donors. And if you set a bar that's too high for folks that may represent a really important piece of your mission, you would really miss out, I think, on what they could bring to the table. At the same time, if you say our minimum is 1,000 or 2,500, and you've got somebody sitting on your board that could easily be giving 10,000 or 15 or 20, it just makes that conversation a little more awkward, I think, to say, well, I know the minimum is this, but really I want you to give that. So I think if you frame it as, you know, look, everybody's got a different giving capacity and different connection to this organization. The reality is we need gifts of all sizes to make this organization run. And some of you around this table are able to be major donors, and we're going to ask you to be major donors. Some of you, you know, don't have capacity, and what we ask from everybody is that your gift is meaningful and it's thoughtful. And I mean, I'm a fan of sitting with every board member and even having that conversation. So it's not a pass the hat moment. I'll tell you, I have a former client that I love this. So just kind of bonus information, but they're a human service organization. They serve kids who are homeless, and they have a board seat that is for a former client. And I love this. And I met this woman the first time I went to their board meeting. And first of all, she's just lovely and dynamic and fabulous. But the perspective she brings to that board, having gone through that program and walked through being a homeless teen, and I mean, and now she's, you know, very much stable and on her feet, but she certainly isn't in a high capacity job and making, you know, a lot of money. So she's not a big donor, is my point. But boy, there's not more passion for that organization, and there's not a better perspective around the needs of the youth in that program. And I've recommended that to other people since I've met them, because I think that's such a great way to bring more life to the board from a program perspective. But I wouldn't want to put somebody like that on the board and say, oh, but there's a minimum commitment of X. So that's a kind of a long answer to your question, but that's the way I would frame it, is meaningful and thoughtful. Some of you are major donors, some of you are not. And just like some of you are going to contribute in certain areas because of your expertise, and some of you can't, those of you that have the ability to give, we're going to ask you to be givers. Those that don't have the financial capacity to give, you're here for other reasons, but we're still going to ask you to contribute in a meaningful way to you. Anything else? We have used our time. I can't believe it. I told you guys we were going to get out early. I lied. Sorry.
Well, I feel like that's a great place to stop too, about that meaningful and the emphasis on the relationship, because I think that's, if nothing else to take away from it, it's that piece. So grateful for everyone today. I've shared in chat, but I'm gonna make sure we follow up with the recording, which I will go ahead and stop right now.